This episode is kindly sponsored by Peridot Partners, a specialist values-led recruitment firm supporting higher education organisations to appoint senior leaders and governors. Peridot specialise in charity and education recruitment, with a dedicated higher education team that understands the sector from the inside, having worked alongside universities to find ambitious leaders committed to continuous improvements and efficiency. Inclusive recruitment sits at the heart of their work. They focus on thoughtful, inclusive search, realistically representing organisations to candidates and helping higher education leadership to better reflect the communities you serve. If you're recruiting a senior leader or governor, or considering your own step in higher education leadership, visit peridot.partners.co.uk. That's PERIDOT partners.co.uk. I'm Susanna Marsden, a higher education consultant who helps to develop and support HE institutions in the UK and beyond. This podcast takes a deep dive into the roles of people who work in this hugely varied higher education sector. Each episode reveals what's involved in a specific role, the career path that led to it, and tips on how to get in and get on in these jobs. My guest in this episode is Professor Emmanuel Adukwu, Dean for Students at UWE Bristol and Professor of Microbiology. Emmanuel started his Dean for Students post just a couple of months ago, transitioning from a Deputy Head of School into this university senior leadership role. A central focus of Emmanuel's career is removing barriers to ensure access and quality of opportunity for all, illustrated in his national and international work, such as Chair of the Minoritised Life Sciences Future Forum, as well as UWE's Dean for Students. Amongst other things, we talk about his career to date, his approach to leading through influence, what ownership thinking means, what's coming up in his Dean for Students role, and how he balances life as a senior leader. Emmanuel, welcome to the podcast and thanks for being my guest in this episode. You're the new Dean for Students at UWE Bristol, a post that you took up just a few weeks ago in November 2025. Can you give us an overview of the remit of the role and where your focus lies?
Thank you, Susanna, for having me. Yes, I took on this role in November at UWE Bristol, and in effect, the remit of my role as Dean for Students is to work with the senior leadership team, work with the Vice Chancellor Executive on the strategic delivery of successful student outcomes for all our students. And that's one of the key things, is really ensuring that we are meeting all our students rather than selected students or some students, and all our learners across the university. And as a senior academic leader, to ensure that we have a very coherent student journey, which will enable the success for the students, and just meeting all the areas around their access to university, transition through university, progression through university, and then obviously the final and the graduate outcomes and what happens to them when they finish. So making sure that all of those are aligned across the institution and all of us are speaking to each other and making sure that we're delivering for all our students. And that also making sure that all our approaches in line with what we're trying to do are inclusive and equitable for all our students. So that's sort of the remit of my role.
And Dean for Students, I mean, it isn't a role you see in every institution. I mean, I've looked at a bit of research and I've spotted them at a few: Warwick, Edinburgh, University of East London, Hertfordshire, and Birmingham City University. Can you say a bit more about where your role fits within the organisation of UWE Bristol, and a bit more about who the range of people you're working with?
Yeah, that's a really good question, but also a really good point, because when I was also thinking about the role, I did a bit of research myself, and I saw there are a handful of universities in the UK who have Dean of Students or Dean for Students, but recognizing the fact that it's something which is a bit more in the US, if you look at the US educational system, and also interacted with other deans of students actually in other universities around the world, even in Africa. So I've met a number of those, and those roles tend to be quite varied. And that's really what's interesting about them, with different sort of responsibilities or portfolios for the deans of students. So it's a really interesting role. But I think one of the good things about this role is the strategic academic leadership role. And I work with colleagues across the senior leadership at the university, which is the Vice Chancellor's Executive, I also work with colleagues in the colleges and schools, so the college deans and the heads of colleges. I'll be working with people who are in the director roles, also in professional services. So I'm working with academics, I'm working with professional services staff, but in particular, I'll be working very closely as my role develops with the student union. So it's academics, it's the staff who are within the professional services, but also making sure that we are working very much with the students, which has been, for me, a very key element of working in academia is not just working with academics, but also working with students for students.
And we'll come back to talking about the Students' Union a little bit later in our conversation. But before we talk more about your Dean for Students role, I want to focus a bit on your academic background in applied microbiology. And I know you worked in industry before moving into higher education in 2010. Can you share some more about your career steps so far?
It's been an interesting journey. As you said, you mentioned the applied microbiology side of things. But my academic background is one that started as someone who wanted to go into med school. And that wasn't actually in the UK. So I started out as someone who wanted to go to med school, aiming to become a medical doctor. And as fortune sometimes has it, you kind of pivot into a different area because of some challenges. And I ended up doing a biomedical science undergraduate degree. So I studied biomedical sciences as an undergraduate student. Then I went into a master's by research carrying out sort of biomedical research then, and found myself going into industry. And I really enjoyed my time in industry. I worked in one of the leading organizations in clinical research. They've actually become the world number one organization in clinical research, which is which is fantastic because at the time I worked there, they were the number four in the world. So it was really working in a really major environment with a lot of biopharma companies and medical related companies, and learning about the discipline in a different way. So what typically away from what we do in academic research, where you kind of focus on your research area, we were working on multiple therapeutic areas. So you had to learn about different therapeutic areas, but also how you get to the point of having a drug in market. So thinking about your different stage of clinical research to when you have a drug in the market. So it was a fascinating experience. But what it did was it made me really enjoy research more. And then I decided to pursue a PhD in applied microbiology. But my research then was really interesting and broad because we were just at a time where we're thinking about community-acquired infections. So thinking about how do we start to think about reducing the burden of community-acquired infections. So that really cut into a microbiology element, but also bringing in that public health perspective into it. Between that time, I also worked in an organization that was actually one of UK's largest integrated higher education assessment and support provider. So where students who were going into university with support needs, disability and all of that. So I started actually working in that area quite a while ago. And that gave me a different insight, things I'd never thought about in terms of how do we think about our student, who is our student, and what needs do the students have. So things like, do we have note takers, for example, or do we have transcribing systems at the university, or do we have the labs set up correctly for students? All of these things actually started informing my own interest in higher education and my practice, because then you think about all of those things when you get into a classroom rather than I expect all my students to be X, and then I'm going to deliver X for all students. But you think about the students when you think about the lecture, you think about the students when you think about the project, you think about the student when you think about the experience that the students will have when they come to university. So that really helped me in terms of developing my passion. And I went into obviously a number of lecturing roles, and beyond that moved on. And I think one of the things that's been quite interesting in my career path is that a lot of the work I've done in higher education has cut across a lot of the areas that we're talking about today in terms of graduate outcomes. So as employability lead, widening participation lead, doing a lot of international partnership development, recruitment for the school and also the university. So building a lot of those portfolios into my roles alongside actually being a passionate teacher and a passionate researcher. So managing all of those has actually given me that insight into what it's like to work with students at different elements, in different situations. And yeah, and that's really kind of the kind of journey that I've been on, and it's been an interesting journey so far.
And you also have a notable professional profile beyond those day jobs that you just talked about. For example, you've previously been chair of the Early Career Scientist Committee of the Society of Applied Microbiology. I think I've got that right.
Yes.
You've engaged with the Africa Initiative Group for Microbiology, and you're currently chair of the Minoritised Life Scientists Future Forum.
Yeah.
What's been and remains your motivation behind that wider work?
So just picking up on some of the things I mentioned in terms of working in spaces where you think about support, but also reflecting on my own journey as even just thinking about myself as an undergraduate student, where there are quite a lot of barriers and potholes I had to get through, even just to get through my undergraduate degree. It made me realize that actually, when we talk about education is not always accessible to everybody, and the opportunities are not always available to everybody. So a lot of my work, especially even as chair of the Early Career Science Committee for what is now called Applied Microbiology International, was really about making sure that A, there was information available, A, there are opportunities also available, and all of these things are accessible to everybody who should know about them. So that's one of the major drivers for me. It's that access and quality of opportunities that people can access. And where there are barriers, how we make sure that we can remove those barriers for people. And I think for me, like sort of key thing that nobody's left behind when we do all of these things, when we have all our strategies and policies, how do we ensure no one is left behind? So if there are people who are at the margins, how do we make sure that our policies and our strategies are factoring those people on the margins to be there? So that has driven a lot of the work that I do. Even as a scientist, I have to still think about, well, who am I not speaking to and who is missing in this conversation, who is not in the room, and how do we make sure their voices are being represented, not just heard, but being represented in our discussions and in our strategies and policies. So these have been the drivers for me in terms of the work that I do externally and making sure that I'm in those spaces where at least I know that I'm representing someone else actually in that space.
Let's move back to your Dean for Students role. Your motivation to support the success of others is clearly a principle that feeds into that role too, and your attention to enabling all students to fulfil their potential and addressing those cultural and structural barriers to equity that do exist in many institutions. Can you share some more about what the student population and demographic looks like at the university, and also a bit more about the specific cultural and structural barriers that need to be addressed?
Yeah. So we are a large university. So we're a university with near 40,000 students on our campuses. So we're a campus-based university. We have three campuses in Bristol, and obviously we have a number of other international partners. So we also have students who are studying UWE degrees in different parts of the world. So that actually increases our student number. Largely, we're full-time. Students are full-time based. So over 70% of our students are full-time. And in terms of the diversity of our students, over 25% are from global majority backgrounds, so diverse backgrounds. I think if you think about what we are, we're a modern university. We're a university that is really pushing the bar in many areas, and we're very successful in a lot of areas. In terms of the students and these sort of cultural and structural barriers, we are quite similar to many universities that we're having to think about what our institution is like, what we are, what we say we are as an institution, and how we reflect that in how we deliver a success for all our students. So some of the structural barriers and cultural barriers we think about, I know across the sector, one of the things that everybody's talking about is the awarding gaps. That remains a challenge that all universities are dealing with. And as a university, is a priority. It's a main priority for the university, and is also a priority for me as Dean for Students at the university, making sure that we have students getting access into certain areas. So where you have access gaps into certain disciplines, that's something that is hot on our priority list, and making sure that actually access wise we have people come into our programs, even from hard to reach area, underserved communities, that we have those students coming in, but also making sure that our systems policies are inclusive in nature. And if we think about higher education has not typically been very inclusive through the decades. And this is something which, yes, there is a focus on it in the country, there's a focus on it in the sector, but we need to be faster and we need to move quicker in actually ensuring that all our students are able to enjoy the benefits of being at university because of the importance of university to their own personal and professional life outcomes. So yeah, some of those barriers, yeah, like I mentioned, the thing about diversity, I think even if you look at the NUS UK reports a few years ago talking about the lack of diversity in terms of staff, for us, we are in a much better position in terms of the diversity of staff, but we can always be better. It talks about the role models. We're trying to make sure that we create opportunities for students to have role models through our staffing as well. So just putting all of those things into place so that our students feel represented and they feel they belong in the space as well. Because actually, when you have that sort of diversity in the space, even for students, it starts to impact the quality of what the student sees as their own outcomes, eventual outcomes as students. So these are some of the things that we're navigating, and these are things that we're putting a lot of things in place to actually address as a university. And hopefully, in my role, I'll be able to influence in some way how that continues to go.
And picking up on that point to do with influence, I mean, your career so far has been very much about focused on making change happen.
Mm.
And in that Dean for Students role and thinking about that range of people that you're working with that you talked about earlier on, you're very much dependent on leading through influence, I guess. What's your approach to that type of leadership? I mean, both within your institution as well as more widely.
I think when I reflect on my journey so far, I've been in several leadership type spaces and leadership roles. One of the things I learned very early on is the type of leader you want to be can determine what outcomes you get. If you want to be the leader who stands at the front and then tells people what to do, you are going to have a lot of barriers and friction. If you want to be the leader who is at the back pushing the team through, then your team actually would produce, and everybody succeeds at the end. So I operate on largely on the side where I would like to build teams and I like to build systems, and systems where there is accountability, responsibility, and ownership. And I particularly like something around ownership thinking, where we all own the problem rather than I am the sole person who actually is the problem and the solutions person, because then that is not sustainable. So I try to build sustainable systems where you have multiple layers of accountability, responsibility, and leadership. But you also find that actually in academic roles, you don't always have teams with you that you're doing. So you then need to influence people. So it is for me actually working across spaces, interacting with people, relationship building. So to get through some of the things that I've been able to achieve in my own academic journey, it's really about those relationships. If you're able to build relationships, build networks, and then open to having conversations and making time to talk to people, because that's another thing. It might just be a 2 minute or 5 minute chat on the corridor or a 30-minute coffee conversation that leads to something happening across the organization. And for me, all of those things do matter. So it's really about recognizing for me that I'm not going to have the answers to everything, but who is the person who has the answer to this question that we have, and how do we make sure that they're part of the solution that we want to create? So that's the model I've always worked with in terms of my own leadership style. And it's always been that thing about leading through influence, which means you have to find ways to talk to people rather than sitting away from people.
Yeah, and I guess without people, you can't get any change to happen at all, can you? It is all about that community building.
Yeah. So people are central to whatever we want to do. So if we're trying to do things, looking at my role, for example, dean for students. If we're trying to make change or create opportunities where there is success for all students, well, we say for all students, which means the students have to be at the heart of the conversation. So the student voice becomes a very central point in that conversation and also in that journey that we want to go on. So for me, it's making sure that we're talking to them, not talking at them, or not just giving to them and taking from them, but actually making sure that we're talking with them and planning with them as well.
Let's pick up a bit more about that point about working with students. And I'm interested to know about your working relationship with the Students' Union in particular. And going back to that title, you've got the title Dean for Students. How does that stack up against the focus of the Students' Union being the students' representative body?
It's a very interesting one, actually. And as we said at the beginning, I'm still very new into the post and trying to work out all of those different layers. But I've historically worked with the student union on multiple projects. So there's been that working relationship with the student union and also understanding what it is they're trying to achieve. At the university, I think we have a really very strong, historically strong working relationship between the VC, the Vice Chancellor's Executive, the senior leadership team, and the student union. And it's really building on that partnership. So we have a partnership board where the student union and the university actually align priorities and actually get to challenge where there needs to be that challenge and push, and that sort of push-pull conversation where we both want the best for each other. So how do we make sure we get the best out of each other? So that's really the kind of relationship that I would like to continue in my role as Dean for Students, where the student union sees me as a very approachable and critical friend, and vice versa. So we actually just worked closely together because ultimately our goals as a university, it's if you look at their goals do not stray away from the goals we want to have as a university. So we should be working together.
And can you share a bit more? I mean, I know you're new into post, but have you got some plans for working with the Students' Union in the coming months and any particular initiatives that you're going to be working on?
Still in development, but it's nothing about collaboration. We're thinking about even some of the work we're doing around graduate outcomes and some of the work we're doing around our access and participation plans and our awarding gaps. So these are things that we're starting to discuss, and they're very core voice in the access and participation plans, and just working with them in making sure that we are all aligned in terms of our goals on that, but also working with them to see where we might be able to create new opportunities that are going to enable the excellence of our student to come out. And for me, that's something which is very key at the back of my mind. It's not just that we're trying to meet certain KPIs, but it's actually what kind of students do we want to have at the university, and what kind of students do we want to graduate from our university, and working with them to achieve that.
Universities are large and complex organisations, as we both know. And while there's usually an overall vision or strategy guiding their work, there can be differences between working in an academic department and working in an institutional role. And you've now had experience of both of those. You were working in a department previously as deputy head, and now you're working in this institutional role as dean for students. You're just a few weeks in. How's that transition been for you? And what are your observations about any similarities or differences of working in those different bits of the organisation?
It's a very good question. It's been an interesting transition because you are no longer speaking to people who might be in your subject area or in your subject discipline. You now have to start thinking across every part of the university. And every part of the university in a role like mine is that you're speaking to academics, you're speaking to technical teams, you're speaking to professional services, you're speaking to students. So everybody, it becomes a main stakeholder, of which you still find it was the same way in the school, but at a smaller scale. So we're now going from 10 times, basically working on 10 to 20 times the scale of the work that I was doing at school level. But it's also recognizing that the priorities haven't actually changed. The priorities that we operated on at school level are the priorities that we're working at a university level, just translated down to school context. So it's now understanding how to work differently at that university level in that sort of complex space where the language is different, the ways of doing things might be different, the campus might be different. So all of those things coming into the conversation. So it's interesting so far, and but I think it also gives the opportunity to translate success from one space, because you then have sort of a strategic oversight of what's going on across the university, is being able to influence that sort of success, so things that are sort of successful things going on in one space, and supporting that into other spaces across the university. So for me, that actually gives me a bit of excitement. I'm that sort of person who I'm an optimist. So I always believe that we can make things happen where things might not be happening as well as they could, or make them work even better than they are. But it's making sure that actually we're able to translate that across different spaces. So it's exciting. I would say it's actually quite exciting just to be in a space where one can potentially be able to influence or make a difference, and a difference in the way that actually enhances or supports the work that colleagues are doing across the university, rather than just what happens somewhere at the center. It's making sure that all of those things are actually shared across the institution, and our students will be better for it.
And you've gone into a new job within the institution rather than coming from outside.
Yeah.
Is there some support around you in terms of moving into that new role for your own, your own development?
Yes, I think it's been really good to see colleagues at senior level all kind of showing up and saying, right, okay, fine, this is what's going on in this space, and I think just being supportive in helping to navigate the space, because they recognize it's a new world in effect. So navigating that new world. And I think what also helps me is the fact that I've been here long enough to understand the way the university operates, but also be aligned with the university's objectives, which is why actually going into this role for me was really important. I am aligned with what the university is trying to get to, and just taking other people along with me, but also having other people support in going along that journey and also making that happen. So yeah, the support has been fantastic, and yes, I look forward to seeing what happens over the next few months to the next few years.
You remain an active researcher alongside your Dean for Students role, and you also continue to engage in wider activities of the type we talked about earlier on. What approach do you take, particularly now in your new role, to managing your time and all of the professional and wider interests that you have?
Um, I think I'm going to be like many other academics who would say, uh, that's a challenge. That is a challenge. And I would not pretend that it's not. It would always be a challenge. We have competing demands all the time in academic positions and in academic roles. And then into the senior leadership role, that also would come in as that, especially when you have the external facing profile and external facing activities. But it's also making sure that we're doing externally feed in quite well into the work I do internally and vice versa. So I think that helps a great deal because most of those things are actually still driven towards how do we enable people to succeed? How do we enable people across the sector to succeed? So the learning experiences from them are translated into the work that I do. And also what I do within my space is also translated back in terms of this is what good success might look like from my experience. So that helps. In terms of managing time, I think from the research element, I think it was a case of just building my own research group and building a strong research community. So I have a research group with a lot of exceptional people who are academics themselves and researchers, and there's been a culture of support. So because of that culture of support, the group is able to run, and we have an approach of actually not just having researchers but leaders. So the model is about training leaders to be active and good researchers. So the group is filled with leaders. So that takes a lot of burden away from me in terms of trying to lead this whole group of people to people leading. And my job just being to just continue to make sure that the space is there and is supporting them with the work that they do. So that means that we're still able to produce research outputs. We're still able to have grants coming for research and things like that. So that's something which continues, and hopefully there will still be space for that. But I'm still trying to figure out the best way, the perfect way. Hopefully, there will be a perfect way where it feels like I don't have to do anything, but we'll see when that time comes. Yeah.
And I guess with your Dean of Students role, I mean, you talked a bit earlier about number of campuses and working with a broader group of people. That presumably changes the way in which you're having to manage your days in comparison to your previous job.
Absolutely, because it means that I would have to not only spend time in the main campus, but go and work from other campuses, go and spend time with colleagues at other campuses, go to where student activities happen on other campuses. And that's something which I'm actually excited about. I felt like I never had much time to do that before because when you're within a school, there's so much going on within the school. But when you're working across university, it kind of opens up the space where you could think, actually, it'd be good to see what's going on within this space because that's what informs what might happen even in the future across institutions. So yes, no, for me that's a key element of it. But it's also just prioritizing and managing that time as well as I can.
A key theme that's come across in the whole episode has been about, your sense of team and your sense of enabling other people. Finishing up our conversation today, I know you've mentioned on your LinkedIn page that you may still become a football manager when you retire. Is life in higher education still preparing you well for that ambition?
Oh, that's a good question. So that was put out there tongue in cheek. Because I always said to people, if I didn't become an academic or go into medicine, if you asked me one thing I wanted to do, it might have been playing football. But I say that because what I learned from playing football early on in my career was team skills. You are not a good team if one person is not delivering. So how do we make sure that everybody on the plate is delivering? But I talk about being a football manager because it's about strategy. I enjoy watching football, but I don't watch football just to get to see who wins. I watch football to understand how people think and the strategies they bring into it. So I watch sports as a result. I watch boxing, I watch tennis, and it's really all about strategy. And I think when I talk about being a football manager when I retire, is how do I bring all of these things together and see whether maybe I can do something fun that I will probably enjoy and keep myself just going for as long as I can. So I'm still having that dream. I would always keep that dream. Who knows? Maybe you might see me one day on your screens.
Emmanuel, thank you so much for being my guest. It's been great talking with you today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Association of Higher Education Professionals and the British University's Finance Directors Group, BUFDOG, are both proud to support Job Shadowing HE as a valuable source of professional insight. The podcast was presented by Susanna Marsden, and you can find out more about her consultancy work at susannamarsden.co.uk. Audio production and music was by me, Rodri Marsden. Find out more about this podcast and hear previous episodes at jobshadowinghe.com.